All right, so we're going to do a little Scrimba challenge here. And what Bob wants us to do is to go ahead and track the applicant's last name as well as their first name. So I just want to first of all show what event.target does. So target basically just returns back information about the event that we're using, and the event comes from this handle change event that appends to this on change event listener. And this event prop we don't choose, it actually comes default with the on change event listener. So the event goes ahead and it gives us a huge object with a bunch of information. And if we want to go ahead and get something like the target, which will return to us the node that went ahead and triggered the event, or the HTML element, we can say B. And let me go ahead and run this again. We can put B, and we get that an input type of text with the placeholder of first name. So this HTML element right here is what triggered the event. And now we want to get the value of it instead of just the input. So this looks like an HTML element, but in reality it's not. It's like one of the child values of this event object. So when we go ahead and we refresh and we say BOB, we get Bob. And this is kind of like it tracking the state real time. So for the assignment, we can go ahead and say last name and then set last name, and then say react.useState, and we can just do empty curly braces. And what we can do is, I'm not sure if set last name will work like this actually. And let's go ahead and connect this to another input. So let's go ahead and say input, and we can say type equals, oh, it's not going to be a password, is it? It's just going to be text. Placeholder is going to equal to last name, and then on change is going to equal to handle change. And we can go ahead and close this out here. So now we should be able to text or to type in the last name. So let's say T test, and we're getting test. One thing that's not looking great here is that I'm only console logging the first name, but instead we are getting the last name. So maybe that's telling me that we should find a different way to do this, because both clicking or both changing the on change of the first name and last name is triggering the same event, which means that the event target value is changing the state for both the first name and the last name. So if I were to kind of separate them, handle last name, I'm not sure if this would be a better way to do this, or if it would matter, but it would seem like to me that it would just not be as accurate, because we're grabbing the same thing for both the first name and the last name. So let's go ahead and say handle last name instead. And if we say Bob, let's go ahead and console.log first name. And let's just say actually John Doe. Now we're getting the last name and we're getting the first name state updated correctly. So that's how I would answer it. All right, so we're back and I'm going to do another challenge. So what he wants us to do is add an email field /state into the form. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to start this from scratch. So first we want to go ahead and make our function called handle change. And this function, of course, is going to take the event. And I want to show what happens when I go ahead and console.log a few statements. So if I console.log event.target and we go ahead and we run it on, let's say, first name, we get the input that basically called it, or the DOM. And then if we do it for last name, we get the last name. So that's what happens when we call event.target. So now if we call event.target.value, we get what we actually placed into these inputs, meaning we can put both of those things together to go ahead and take the set form data and take the previous state, or in other words, just grab the object that's here. So grab the previous form data, and then we can go ahead and we can obviously take that object and we can spread in the old state. So once we spread in the old state, we can go ahead and, so one thing that I think I need to do here is use the object literal syntax and then take in the previous state or the previous object. And for the second thing, we can say event.target.name. And actually, I just realized I didn't explain this part. So what we get from the event.target.name when we go ahead and type into one of these is we get the name of the input field that we're referencing. So we get the name, first name, and then last name. And what this basically means is that because we have the same first name and last name inside of our use state and the input form, we can reference this key from our original state using that event.target.name. So why wouldn't we just say, let's say, first name and like last name? And this is because this is wet code. So wet means write everything twice. And that's basically what we're doing. We're just writing everything here twice. Instead, we want to do something dry. And by dry, I mean don't repeat yourself. That's what dry code means. And I just learned that in the cast. So now we can equal this to our event.target.value. And right now this doesn't work, but we can use an ES6 feature called, I completely forgot what it was called. Let me go back to my notes and actually see what it's called. Did I exit out of it? I think I did. So let me open up my code and see what it's called real quick. Computed properties. And what it basically does is that it allows us to use dynamic strings. So by dynamic, I think it means strings that are kind of referencing other strings or kind of like routes. So this is going into event and then going into target and then going into name. So these type of dynamic strings can now be used kind of like variables instead of strings, because a regular variable would work. But since this is dynamic, meaning it's going into different places, it won't work. But when we wrap it inside of the array, it will work as a variable. And then this is going to equal to the event target's value, meaning that when we add some test, it goes into first the correct name that's referenced both in the object and the input name, and the right value, which is being referenced inside of this text box right here. And then obviously if we do last name, it'll work. Go back to first name, it'll work. And now we can look at it in the console, seeing that it's all working. And so what he wants us to do is to add an input field in state. So first we can go here and we can say our email, and we'll equal that to an empty string. And then we can add another input here and this is going to be a type of email, and this is going to say email address, and this is going to call the same function. And remember, we want this email to be the same name. If they're not the same name, we're going to get an error. So now if we say Joe at gmail.com, it'll work correctly, and we'll get Joe at gmail.com. And what if we named this something different? What if we said emails? What's going to happen is that now our target event target name, so the name of this input field, is going to be different from the name of this object here, or the key in this object. So when we type something in, I guess it'll work, but what we're seeing is that it's not updating the email, it's creating a brand new key, and we do not want this to happen. We just want to go ahead and just reference the email directly. So if we say joe at gmail.com, it should work correctly. So that's that challenge, and that's how we can go ahead and put these forms into their own object and reference them without having to create 5 different functions, or 3 different functions in this case, to track the state of each of the first name, last name, and email address. So that's pretty much it for that challenge. Moving on. All right, so I'm back, and I just wanted to kind of explain the controlled components. So a controlled component in React is kind of like a component that is getting its state from the parent. So going back to our app where we were changing the color of the different boxes, one problem that we were having was that each box was changing its own state. So we were passing a value into the box, and then the box was changing its own state. And although it would refresh all of the boxes, one thing was that the array containing the on value would sometimes not match with the box. And that's the same problem we have with our input fields. So by default, inputs are already containing their own state, meaning that when we put in something like Bob, it means that the input is holding its own state. But when we use the value, what we can go ahead and do is add the form data and the first name, so the key that we need to reference, and now we can get the state, or the value of the state, directly from the updated state. So one thing that we can do to kind of show this is that when we run this and we say Bob, if we go ahead and reload, let's put in Bob one more time. If we go into the first name and we change Bob to Joe and we run this, that is what we will load up. And that's kind of showing that React is now in the driver's seat for setting up the state instead of the input field itself. So the value of the input field is now being obtained from the form data object's first name, meaning that when we refresh again, we get Joe. So that's just a small explanation, but I just kind of wanted to put that in there. All right, so now we're going to work on another challenge, and we're going to see how to use the text area, and we're going to use it for something called comments, and we can also add it to state to make sure it works. So first of all, we can go here, we can say comment, and we're just going to make it an empty string. And then we're going to go here and we're going to say text area. And in React, text area is self-closing, meaning that we don't have to provide any closing tag. And now we can say the name of this text area is going to be comment. So this is basically going to make sure that the event target name, so the event target name is going to be the name from this input field, matches the name inside, or the key inside of our form data. But now we want to let React be in control of the state, because now if we say React is in control, we don't get anything. But when we add Joe here, we do get something. So to fix this, we want this to get its value from the form data dot comment. And now React is in control instead of the text area being in control. So this basically means that React is giving the text area its state instead of the text area holding its own state. And that's that challenge. And I just want to come back because I realized I completely forgot something. So when we go ahead and go into our console and run this, when we type inside of this, nothing happens. And that's because what we need to do is go ahead and do an on change and equal that to handle change. So now when we type, we will go ahead and see the value of it. If we go ahead and console.log form data, we will see that our comment will be working, our email's working, our first name and last name is working. So that's what I needed to add. Kind of forgot that part. All right, so I finally got through all of the videos and I want to go ahead and do the forms quiz. So the first question is, in vanilla JavaScript, at what point in the form submission process do you gather all the data from the filled out form? And that's pretty easy. It's at the very end. So at the very end, when you fill in all of these values here or fill in all of these input boxes and then press submit, that is when you actually get the data. In React, it's different because we're getting the data live and storing it in state. So we're looking for any changes, meaning that if we put the first name in, let me see if I can get this to work so that I can kind of show. So if we go ahead and console.log our form data, we will notice that we're getting our values live. So let's go ahead and refresh. And let's say Joe. As you can see, we're getting all of our stuff live and on every single instance of a change. So D comes up if we put in D, O, and E comes up when we put in O and E. So we're getting this the form data on every single change, whereas in HTML we get it when we click submit. So which attribute in the form element, value, name, on change, etc. should match the property name being held in state for that input? So this is pretty simple. So the name needs to be matching with the property name inside of the object. So if we go here and we see Y, we see that we're destructuring, or let's even go back to the more basic one where we're saying the event.target.name. So in this object destructuring, we're getting the previous object. That means all of the properties from our previous object. And we're referencing the event target name as these properties that are inside of the object. And then we want to place in the event target value. So the value would be these values of the key value pairs. So what happens is if that the name is different from the value, or if the name is different from the name provided inside of our object, we actually won't update because the name here of this input is corresponding with the name used inside of this event target.name. Because when we log out event.target, I'll go ahead and show you what happens. When we go ahead and log this out and we say Joe or J, you see that we get the input with the placeholder, the name, and everything. And then we, of course, get the value. Meaning that if the name was different, let's go ahead and add an error here or in typo. When we say Joe, we're getting the wrong name, but what we'll see is that when we submit, well, we're still getting, hold on, let me make sure. We see that it's adding another property of first name with 2 E's instead of name with 1 E. So what we're seeing here is that it's not actually updating the object correctly, meaning that it's not really setting it inside of the state correctly. So moving on, what's different about saving the data? What's different about saving the data from the checkbox element versus every other form element? So when we're using the checkbox element, since we can't go ahead and set the value directly, what we would do is set the checked. So the reason why this is because it holds a boolean and not an actual string. So what we would have to do is reference the name and then the type. And then if the type is equals to a checkbox, we would run checked. And checked is going to check whether something is true or false. And if we go down to our, let's say to our checkbox, what we can see is that on change, it's still handling our click. Oh, this is the radio button. I think we're looking for our checkboxes. So on checked, it's finding the form data and it's saying whether or not it's friendly. So this is a boolean, either true or false. On change, we're going to run the handle change, and then instead we are going to do something different. So the handle change is basically going to be ran differently, like I kind of showed above. I kind of got a little bit tongue twisted there, but it's different because on the change, instead of going ahead and putting in a string into one of these values, it's checking for a boolean. So when we go ahead and check for checked, it's going to check whether or not it's a true or falsy value. And I want to come back here for a second because I feel like I didn't understand this part all the way. So I'll have to go back. Oh, right here, this checked input, that's also this checked destructured input from the event.target is equal to the is friendly. So meaning that if the type is a checkbox, we'll run checked, which is running is friendly. And if it's true, then that means we will have it checked, and it is checked by default. But if it's false, it will be unchecked by default, and we'll go ahead and keep true. So the last question is, how do you watch for a form submit? How can you trigger a form submit? So to watch for a form submit, you would basically give the form an on submit handler. And this on submit handler is going to run a function, and it's going to go ahead and handle the submit. And this handle submit function is going to take an event. In short, I just put E, but it's event. And one thing that we want to do is go ahead and prevent default. And this prevents the form from reloading. And then another thing we want to do is we can just console.log the form data, meaning that when we go ahead and we put something like Joe Schmo, I'm just using what Bob uses. And then this is a test. And then we say Joe Schmo's not friendly. He's a full-time worker, and his favorite color is, let's say, red. And if we submit, we get all of Joe's data. So we get, he's a full-time worker. His name is Joe. His last name Schmo. He's not friendly. His favorite color is red. And we get the message of this is a test. So I'm pretty sure that's all of the questions. Forms aren't too difficult to work with in React. I'll definitely have to go ahead and run a few tests on my own without looking through my notes and just trying to get it to work. But that is pretty much it.